Hey there, welcome back to Business 101, Introduction to Business. And in this third lecture of this series in Module 9, we look at some of the early approaches or understandings or attempts to understand and analyze what is leadership all about. So, let's take a look and see how people have been thinking about leadership in the past to help us inform our understanding now and our path to contemporary theories on leadership. You can see here from this slide with the wonderful, gorgeous George Clooney that one of the earliest approaches to leadership, to try to understand leadership, was to think that leaders really were born rather than made or developed or trained. And so some folks are simply born leaders. What determines a born leader? Well, the earliest thought were looking for essential static traits that were there, genetically or from birth, that predisposed a woman or a man to be a better leader than other human beings. And you can see there in the second bullet point, some of the things we thought made a great leader was, well, are they smart? Do they seem to have an aggressive, assertive, or dominant personality? Were they full of self-confidence, energy, a bias towards action, quick to make a decisive decision, full of knowledge, tall, good-looking, etc., etc.? And some of you, of course, even as you think of your dear professor, you think, well, he is so good-looking and tall and well-featured. He must be a born leader. And of course, I would have to respectfully and humbly decline those compliments and let you know that, well, really, this kind of thinking that leaders are born leaders with certain traits really kind of petered out, really went nowhere. And there's a couple of reasons for that. As longer and longer lists were made of what really makes a born leader, it got to the point where the lists themselves, the lists of traits and characteristics, became simply unwieldy and difficult to manage. And then, of course, as lists get longer and longer, you begin to see all sorts of historical exceptions. For instance, if all leaders are tall and good looking, then how on earth did we end up with Napoleon Bonaparte, the French revolutionary leader, or other leaders, right? If all leaders are winsome and charismatic and full of all these kinds of things, then what about this guy or that guy? And you sort of understand then that part of the downfall of this way of looking at it is simply that however you want to say that in general, born leaders look like this or have these kinds of characteristics and traits, we simply have too many historical examples to really buy into this notion that leaders are born and not made. And so our study of leadership, the academic study of leadership, really began to move away from the idea that there are born traits and characteristics and instead moved towards what we call the behavioral approach to leadership that instead focuses not so much on who you are, but rather what you do. That leadership is defined by a set of behaviors, not innate or born or genetic traits. The first look or the first notion about the behavioral approach to leadership then, the early suggestions about this focused on really two categories of behavior. And those are, you can see there, leaders who tended to focus on tasks versus leaders that tended to focus on the employees themselves. So the first task-focused leader behavior, you can see the textbook description, behavior demonstrated by the leader that tends to focus on how tasks should be performed to meet goals, achieve performance standards, those kinds of things, versus the kind of focused, the employee-focused behavior, the second bullet point, behavior focusing on the satisfaction, motivation, and well-being of employees. And so a great deal of work was done there to sort of define and categorize different sets of behaviors. Of course, in the real world, generally speaking, most reasonable leaders had a mixture, a cocktail of both of these kinds of behaviors, right? And so it was difficult to find a leader who was only focused on, for instance, the second bullet point, who only focused on the satisfaction, well-being, and motivation of employees, and really paid no mind whatsoever to actually accomplishing tasks and meeting goals. And it was also difficult to find leaders who focused exclusively on goals, performance, and really paid no heed, focus, or attention toward the employees, right? Now, what do we make of this then? Well, again, from the earliest time as we began to recognize that there are different effectivenesses of leaders. If you compare leader A to B to C, it would be easy to tell over time that some leaders were more effective than others. And as we start asking the question, what really is at the root of these differences in leader effectiveness, after getting past the point of saying, well, it must be simply born, we began to understand that leaders have different sets of focuses. And some of these can be broken into the big broad categories of task-focused versus employee-focused, and our thinking continued from there. That then becomes sort of a very quick look in this third lecture about some early thought about leadership. We'll continue to look at these in the next lecture.